Welcome back to another incredible story. If you're new here, this channel brings you powerful emotional narratives every week. Stories about family, secrets, and the choices that change everything. Subscribe now so you never miss an upload. Trust me, today's story will leave you speechless. Let's begin. Margaret Henderson, 78 years old and fiercely independent, had been trapped in her 2004 Honda Civic for 3 days when her neighbor, 26-year-old Jenna Walsh, finally noticed something was wrong. The car sat in Margaret's driveway on Maple Street, in the quiet suburb of Riverside, Oregon, exactly where it had been parked since Tuesday afternoon, its windows fogged with condensation that made it impossible to see inside. Jenna had walked past the car at least a dozen times over those 3 days, rushing to and from her apartment above Margaret's garage, preoccupied with her own problems, a demanding job at a tech startup, a relationship that was falling apart, the constant pressure of being 26 and feeling like she should have her life figured out by now. But on Friday morning, as October rain drummed against the pavement and fog rolled in from the nearby river, Jenna paused beside the Honda and noticed something that made her stomach drop. There was a handprint on the inside of the driver's side window, pressed against the glass as if someone had been trying to get out, and beneath the condensation, she could just barely make out the shape of someone sitting in the driver's seat, completely still. Jenna's first thought was that Margaret had died in her car, and her second thought, shameful but honest, was that she should have checked on her elderly neighbor sooner, should have noticed something was wrong days ago. But as she moved closer, wiping away some of the condensation from the outside of the window, she saw Margaret's eyes open, saw them focus on her with desperate relief, and realized with horror that the elderly woman was alive, conscious, and had been trapped there for days, unable to escape, while life continued normally all around her, and not a single person had thought to check. Jenna yanked on the car door handle, but it was locked from the inside. She knocked on the window, her heart racing. "Mrs. Henderson, can you unlock the door?" Margaret's lips moved, but no sound came through the glass. Her face was pale, her lips cracked and dry, and even through the foggy window, Jenna could see she was in bad shape. Margaret's hand reached toward the door lock, trembling with effort, but she couldn't seem to make her fingers work properly. She tried again, her movements slow and weak, and finally managed to pull up the lock. Jenna wrenched the door open, and the smell hit her immediately. Urine, sweat, and the stale air of a sealed space occupied for too long. "Oh my God, Mrs. Henderson, what happened? How long have you been out here?" Jenna asked, reaching in to help the elderly woman, who was shaking uncontrollably. Margaret tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat too dry to form words properly. Jenna grabbed her phone and dialed 911, reporting the situation while trying to assess Margaret's condition. The elderly woman was wearing the same cardigan and slacks Jenna remembered seeing her in earlier that week, now rumpled and soiled. Her white hair, usually so carefully styled, hung limply around her face. "Help is coming, Mrs. Henderson. Just hang on. Can you tell me what happened? Why couldn't you get out?" Margaret's lips moved again, and this time Jenna leaned in close enough to hear the whispered words, "Locked me in. He locked me in." Jenna felt ice run down her spine. Someone had locked Margaret in her own car? Who locked you in? Who did this to you? But before Margaret could answer, her eyes rolled back, and she slumped forward. Jenna caught her, struggling to support the elderly woman's weight, while keeping her phone pressed to her ear as the 911 operator gave instructions. Within minutes, sirens wailed down Maple Street, and Jenna's quiet Friday morning erupted into chaos. The paramedics arrived first, efficiently transferring Margaret onto a stretcher and starting an IV for severe dehydration. One of them, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, asked Jenna if she knew how long Mrs. Henderson had been in the car. "I don't know for sure. Maybe 3 days. I saw her Tuesday afternoon coming home with groceries, and then I didn't see her again until now. I should have checked on her sooner. I walk past this car every single day." The paramedic squeezed her shoulder. "You found her. That's what matters. 3 days without water is serious, but she's conscious, which is a good sign." Do you know if she has any family we should contact? Jenna realized with a sinking feeling that she had no idea. Margaret had lived on Maple Street for over 40 years, according to neighborhood law. But Jenna had only moved into the garage apartment 8 months ago and had never bothered to learn much about her landlord beyond the basics. Margaret was the woman who collected rent on the first of each month, who kept her lawn immaculately maintained, who waved politely but never invited conversation. Jenna had thought of her as just another face in the neighborhood, not as a real person with a life and history and people who cared about her. The police arrived as the ambulance was preparing to leave, and a young officer with a notebook approached Jenna. "You're the one who found her. I'm Officer Ryan Martinez. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Jenna explained about the fogged windows, the handprint, Margaret's whispered words about being locked in. Officer Martinez's expression grew serious. "She said someone locked her in the car? Did she say who?" "She started to, but then she passed out. Do you think someone did this on purpose? Like tried to hurt her?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, an older woman with grey hair pulled back in a tight bun. "We'll need to investigate. Officer Chen and I will need to process the vehicle as a potential crime scene." "Did you touch anything inside the car besides Mrs. Henderson herself?" Jenna shook her head, suddenly aware of how surreal this situation was. An hour ago, she'd been making coffee and scrolling through her phone, and now she was standing in the rain, watching police photograph her landlord's car as evidence in what might be an attempted murder. By that afternoon, Margaret's story had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Jenna's phone buzzed constantly with texts from neighbors she barely knew, all wanting details, offering theories, expressing shock that something like this could happen on their quiet street. A local news van arrived, and a reporter with perfectly styled hair asked Jenna for an interview, which she declined. She felt guilty enough already without having her face plastered on the evening news. At the hospital, Margaret was admitted with severe dehydration, hypothermia, and a urinary tract infection. According to the doctors, she would likely recover physically, though 3 days without food or water at her age had taken a serious toll. The bigger question was what had happened to leave her trapped in her car, and whether someone had deliberately done this to her. Detective Lisa Chen, who had been at the scene that morning, called Jenna that evening. "Ms. Walsh, we've processed Mrs. Henderson's vehicle and found some concerning evidence. The child safety locks were engaged on the back doors, and the driver's side door lock appears to have been tampered with to prevent it from opening from the inside. This wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately trapped her in that car." Jenna felt sick. Who would do that to an old woman? Has she been able to tell you anything? She's still too weak to give a full statement, but she did say something interesting. She said, "He said it was for my own good." Does that mean anything to you? Do you know if Mrs. Henderson has any family members or friends who might have access to her car? Jenna admitted she knew almost nothing about Margaret's personal life, which made her feel even worse. She had lived 30 feet away from this woman for 8 months, and couldn't even tell the police if she had children or siblings or anyone who cared about her. That night, unable to sleep, Jenna did something she probably should have done months ago. She Googled her landlord. What she found surprised her. Margaret Henderson had been a prominent civil rights attorney in Portland during the 1970s and 80s, known for taking on controversial cases and fighting for marginalized communities. There were photos of her from 40 years ago, young and fierce, standing on courthouse steps with clients, giving interviews, accepting awards. Then around 1995, she seemed to disappear from public life entirely, retiring early and moving to the small suburb of Riverside. In the few interviews Jenna could find from that period, Margaret cited a desire for a quieter life, but there was something in the carefully worded statements that suggested there was more to the story. Jenna dug deeper, searching through archived news articles and court records. What she discovered made her sit back in shock. In 1994, Margaret had been the lead attorney in a high-profile case involving police brutality. Her client, a young black man named Andre Williams, had been severely beaten during a traffic stop, and Margaret had successfully sued the police department for $3 million. But during the trial, she had received death threats, her car had been vandalized, and there had been an incident where someone had broken into her Portland home. The case had made national news, and Margaret had won, but at what cost? Over the following weeks, as Margaret recovered and prepared to testify against her son, an unexpected thing happened. The story of the elderly civil rights attorney nearly killed by her own son spread beyond the local news, and people who had known Margaret decades ago began reaching out. Former clients, colleagues, people whose lives she had touched during her years as an attorney. They sent letters, emails, made phone calls. A group of attorneys she had mentored in the 1980s started a crowdfunding campaign to help with her medical expenses and to support her through the trial. The campaign went viral, raising over $500,000 and bringing national attention to Margaret's story. But it wasn't just the attempted murder that captured people's imagination. It was the rediscovery of Margaret Henderson, civil rights warrior, and the realization that a woman who had been so visible and vital had spent the last decades of her life alone and forgotten. Her contributions to justice largely overlooked by a new generation. A documentary filmmaker reached out, wanting to tell Margaret's story, not just the recent tragedy, but her entire life, the cases she had won, the people she had helped, the legacy she had built. Margaret initially refused, uncomfortable with the attention, but Jenna encouraged her to reconsider. "You spent 3 days in a car rather than let your son take away your autonomy," Jenna pointed out. "You fought for other people's rights for decades. Maybe it's time to let people fight for yours. Let people know your story. Let them see you as more than just elderly woman, almost killed by son. You're so much more than that." Margaret eventually agreed, and the documentary became a passion project for both her and the filmmaker. In the process of putting together her story, Margaret reconnected with people from her past, rebuilding relationships that had faded over years of isolation. She learned that many people had tried to stay in touch after she retired, but she had been the one to pull away, believing she needed to leave her old life behind completely. "I was so tired," she explained to Jenna one evening as they sat in Margaret's hospital room, watching the sun set through the window. "After that last case, after all the death threats and the break-in and the constant stress, I just wanted peace. I wanted to disappear into a quiet life where no one expected anything from me, where I could just exist without having to fight all the time. But somewhere along the way, I disappeared so completely that even I forgot who I used to be." The trial of Thomas Henderson took place 6 months after Margaret's rescue. She testified clearly and powerfully, describing her son's actions without emotion, but with devastating precision. Thomas's defense attorney tried to paint Margaret as a cold, neglectful mother who had driven her son to desperation. But the prosecution countered with testimony from Margaret's former colleagues and clients, painting a picture of a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others, often at great personal cost. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Thomas guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the judge noting the particularly cruel nature of his crime. "You didn't just try to kill your mother," Judge Patricia Wilson said during sentencing. "You tried to rob her of her dignity, her autonomy, and her right to control her own life. You tried to paint her as incompetent and helpless, when in reality, she's one of the most competent and capable people to ever stand in a courtroom. Your crime wasn't just attempted murder. It was an attempt to erase everything your mother had worked her entire life to build." After the trial, Margaret returned to her house on Maple Street, where Jenna still lived in the garage apartment. Their relationship had transformed from distant landlord-tenant into something more like family. Jenna, who had been estranged from her own parents for years, found in Margaret a mentor and friend. Margaret, who had spent so long alone, rediscovered what it meant to have someone care about her well-being. The documentary about Margaret's life premiered at a major film festival and later aired on a national streaming platform. It sparked renewed interest in the cases she had worked on and led to a re-examination of several other police brutality cases from that era. A law school established a scholarship in Margaret's name for students interested in civil rights law. A community center in Portland named their legal aid clinic after her. But perhaps the most significant change was in Margaret herself. The woman who had spent 3 days in a car rather than ask for help learned slowly and sometimes painfully to let people back into her life. She started attending events, giving talks at law schools, mentoring young attorneys. She accepted help when she needed it, but on her own terms, maintaining the autonomy she had fought so hard to protect, while also accepting that independence doesn't mean isolation. 1 year after Jenna found her trapped in that car, Margaret hosted a small gathering at her house. It wasn't a celebration of what had happened. Nothing about that ordeal was worth celebrating. Instead, it was a gathering of all the people who had come back into her life in the aftermath, all the connections renewed and relationships rebuilt. Jenna helped set up tables in the backyard, and as guests arrived, she watched Margaret move through the crowd with ease, laughing and talking, and fully present in a way Jenna had never seen before. "She's different now," said one of Margaret's former colleagues, a man in his 70s who had worked with her in the 1980s. "More open, more willing to let people in. It's tragic that it took something so awful to bring her back to us. But I'm grateful to have her back." Later that evening, as guests were leaving and the sun was setting, Jenna and Margaret sat on the back porch together. "You know," Margaret said, "I spent decades fighting for other people's right to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with dignity. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to apply those same principles to myself. I made myself invisible because I thought that was safer, easier, less complicated. And I almost died because of it. Not just physically, but in every way that matters." "But you didn't die," Jenna pointed out. "You survived. And look at everything that's happened since. The documentary, the scholarship, all the people you're helping again. You're more visible now than ever." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "But I think the real change is that I finally understand that being visible isn't the same as being vulnerable. I can be seen without giving up my strength. I can accept help without surrendering my autonomy. I can let people care about me without becoming the helpless old woman my son tried to make me into." She paused, looking out at the darkening sky. "You know what the irony is? Thomas thought he was going to prove I was incompetent by trapping me in that car. He thought 3 days without help would break me, would make me seem confused and helpless. But instead, I proved exactly how competent I am. I survived. I refused to give him what he wanted. And when I finally was found, I was strong enough to tell the truth, to fight back, to reclaim my story. He wanted to take away my voice, but he actually helped me find it again," Jenna smiled. "That's the most Margaret Henderson thing I've ever heard. Finding empowerment in attempted murder." "Well, when you put it that way, it sounds rather dramatic," Margaret said with a slight laugh. Then her expression grew serious. "But truly, Jenna, thank you. If you hadn't noticed that handprint, if you hadn't checked on me that morning—" "I almost didn't," Jenna admitted. "I almost walked right past like I'd been doing for days. I was so caught up in my own problems, my own life. It scares me to think about how close I came to not noticing." The next morning, Jenna visited Margaret in the hospital. She found the elderly woman propped up in bed, looking frailer than Jenna had ever seen her, but with her eyes clear and alert. "Jenna," Margaret said, her voice still hoarse but stronger than it had been. "Thank you for finding me. They told me I probably wouldn't have lasted another day." Jenna pulled up a chair, unsure how to begin. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm so sorry I didn't notice sooner. I walked past your car so many times and never thought—" Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "You're young and busy. Why would you think to check on your boring old landlord?" She smiled slightly, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Besides, I've spent most of my life being invisible. I can hardly blame you for not seeing me." "You're not invisible," Jenna protested. "I've been reading about you, about your work as an attorney. You were incredible. You changed people's lives." Margaret's expression shifted, something guarded coming over her face. "That was a long time ago. A different life. Mrs. Henderson, the police said someone deliberately trapped you in that car. They said you mentioned, he said it was for my own good. Do you know who did this to you?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her hands folded in her lap. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My son, it was my son, Thomas." Jenna felt the room tilt. "Your son? I didn't know you had a son." "Why would he—" "Because he thinks I'm losing my mind," Margaret said flatly. "He thinks I have dementia, that I'm not capable of taking care of myself anymore, and he wants to put me in a nursing home so he can sell my house and take control of my finances." I refused. So he decided to prove I was incompetent by creating a situation where I would appear helpless and confused. The story poured out of Margaret then, the words coming faster, as if a dam had broken. Thomas Henderson was her only child, 52 years old, divorced, unemployed, and deeply resentful of the mother who had, in his view, prioritized her career over her family. He had been pressuring Margaret for months to sign over power of attorney, claiming she was forgetting things, getting confused, becoming a danger to herself. Margaret insisted she was fine. She had her routines, her doctor said she was healthy for her age, and she was still perfectly capable of managing her own life. But Thomas had been relentless. He had started showing up unannounced, going through her mail, questioning her decisions, telling neighbors to watch for signs of her deteriorating condition. When Margaret had threatened to cut him out of her will entirely if he didn't stop, Thomas had apparently decided to take matters into his own hands. "He came over Tuesday afternoon," Margaret explained, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. "Said he wanted to take me to lunch, make amends." I was foolish enough to believe him. We got in my car, he was driving, and then he pulled over on some side street and said we needed to talk. He started going on again, about me needing more help, about how he was worried about me, and I told him I'd heard enough. I tried to get out of the car, but the door wouldn't open. He had done something to the lock. I tried the back doors, but the child locks were on. He just sat there, calm as could be, and said, "Mom, I'm doing this for your own good. You need to see that you can't take care of yourself anymore. When someone finds you, confused and unable to even get out of a car, everyone will understand that you need help." Jenna listened in horror as Margaret described how Thomas had driven her back to her house, parked in the driveway and simply walked away, leaving his elderly mother trapped in the car in her own driveway. He said someone would find me eventually, that I'd be disoriented and weak, and it would prove his point that I couldn't live independently. What he didn't count on was that I'm more stubborn than he realized. I didn't call for help. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of proving his point. I thought surely someone would notice the car had been sitting for days, would check on me. But hours turned into a day, then 2 days, then 3, and I started to realize I might die rather than let him win. "Mrs. Henderson, you could have died. You almost did die. Why didn't you just call for help?" Margaret's eyes flashed with something fierce and familiar, the same expression Jenna had seen in those old photographs of the civil rights attorney on the courthouse steps. "Because my whole life I fought against people who tried to take away other people's autonomy, their right to make their own choices. And here was my own son trying to do exactly that to me. I wasn't going to give him what he wanted. I wasn't going to play the helpless old woman who needed rescuing. Even if it killed me, I was going to prove I could make my own decisions. Jenna didn't know whether to admire Margaret's stubbornness or be frustrated by it. But you did need rescuing. I rescued you. No, Margaret said firmly. You found me. There's a difference. I survived. I outlasted him. And now he's going to face consequences for what he did. Detective Chen arrived shortly after, and Margaret gave her full statement. Armed with Margaret's account, the police located Thomas Henderson at his apartment in Portland. When they arrested him, he initially tried to claim his mother was confused, that she was imagining things, that this was proof she needed psychiatric care. But the physical evidence didn't lie. The tampered door lock, the engaged child safety locks, and the fact that Thomas's fingerprints were all over Margaret's car sealed his fate. He was charged with attempted murder, false imprisonment, and elder abuse. But as the investigation deepened, an even more disturbing picture emerged. Detective Chen discovered that Thomas had been systematically stealing from his mother for over a year, forging her signature on checks, using her credit cards without permission, taking out loans in her name. He had accumulated over $200,000 in debt using her credit and had been desperate to access her assets. When Margaret had refused to give him power of attorney or help him financially, he had escalated to trying to have her declared incompetent so he could gain control of her estate legally. The revelation devastated Margaret in ways that the physical ordeal had not. I knew he was angry with me, she told Jenna during one of her daily hospital visits, which had become routine. I knew he resented my career, felt neglected as a child, blamed me for his father leaving. But I never thought he hated me enough to do something like this. To steal from me, to try to kill me, her voice broke. How did I raise a person capable of that? Jenna, who had grown close to Margaret over the past week, reached for her hand. You didn't raise him to be that person. People make their own choices. You spent your life fighting for justice and helping people. His choices are his own. I was never a good mother, Margaret said quietly. I was too busy with my cases, too focused on changing the world to pay attention to what was happening in my own home. His father left because I prioritized work over family. Thomas grew up feeling second best to my clients, my causes. Maybe if I had been there more, been better at balancing— Stop, Jenna interrupted gently. You can't blame yourself for his choices now, as an adult man in his 50s. Yes, maybe things could have been different when he was growing up. But trying to murder your elderly mother because you're in debt isn't normal childhood resentment. That's something else. Something broken in him that isn't your fault. But you did notice, Margaret said firmly. When it mattered, you paid attention. You saw me. That's the thing about being invisible. Sometimes it only takes one person really looking to change everything. The conversation stayed with Jenna long after that night. She thought about all the people she passed every day without really seeing them, all the neighbors she exchanged polite nods with, but never actually connected to, all the opportunities for human connection she let slip by because she was too busy or too preoccupied or too convinced that other people's lives were none of her business. Margaret's ordeal had taught her that isolation wasn't just dangerous for elderly people living alone. It was dangerous for all of them, for every person who went through life believing they didn't need anyone, that self-sufficiency meant never asking for help, that independence required keeping everyone at arm's length. The story of the elderly woman trapped in her car for days had initially been sensational, shocking, the kind of headline that made people pause and exclaim and then move on with their lives. But for those directly involved, for Margaret, for Jenna, for the community that had rallied around them, it had become something deeper. It had become a story about the cost of invisibility, about the way people can disappear even while living in plain sight, about the importance of seeing and being seen, about the difference between independence and isolation. As Margaret often said in the interviews she gave after the documentary came out, I spent 3 days in that car because I was stubborn and proud and unwilling to admit I needed help. But I spent 30 years invisible because I believed that was what safety looked like. I was wrong. Safety isn't isolation. Safety is community. Safety is being connected to people who notice when you're not okay, who check on you not out of nosiness, but out of genuine care. Safety is being seen. The case sparked a broader conversation about elder abuse, about how often it comes from within families, about the particular vulnerability of older people who have outlived their support networks or who, like Margaret, have deliberately isolated themselves. Support groups formed, community programs were established, and new protocols were put in place to help identify at-risk seniors before tragedy struck. But perhaps the most important legacy of Margaret's story was simpler and more personal. It was about 2 women, one 78, one 26, who had been living 30 feet apart for months without really knowing each other, without really seeing each other, and who had been brought together by tragedy, but had chosen to build something meaningful from it. 3 years after the incident, Margaret published a memoir about her life, her career and her near-death experience. The book became a bestseller, not because of the sensational elements of the story, but because of Margaret's unflinching honesty about her own choices and mistakes. She wrote about being an imperfect mother, about prioritizing her career over her family, about the guilt and regret she carried. But she also wrote about refusing to let that guilt define her, about understanding that she could acknowledge her failures without being destroyed by them, about the possibility of building new relationships and new purpose, even in the final chapters of life. She dedicated the book to Jenna with the inscription, "To the young woman who saw me when I had made myself invisible, who looked when others passed by, who reminded me that it's never too late to be found, Jenna, who had since changed careers to become a social worker specializing in elder advocacy," kept the dedication page framed in her office. She often shared Margaret's story with her clients, using it to illustrate points about isolation, about family dynamics, about the importance of maintaining connections and accepting help without sacrificing independence. And on quiet evenings, when her work felt overwhelming and she wondered if she was making any real difference, she would think about that foggy October morning when she had paused beside a car she had walked past a dozen times before, when she had noticed a handprint on a window, when she had chosen to look instead of walking by. One person paying attention at the right moment had saved a life. One person being seen had sparked a transformation. One elderly woman trapped in a car had become a catalyst for change, not because of what was done to her, but because of how she refused to let it define her, how she transformed tragedy into purpose, how she proved that being found wasn't the same as being helpless, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let yourself be seen. Margaret Henderson had spent 3 days trapped in her car, and 30 years trapped in her own isolation. But in the end, what her neighbors discovered shocked them, not because it was horrifying, though it was, but because it revealed a woman of extraordinary strength, resilience and wisdom, who had been living among them all along, waiting only to be seen.